Everyone knows the British Empire ruled a quarter of the world, but few know how it started, not with power, but with quiet survival. Before there were colonies, there were invaders. Before there was London, there was a land divided by tribes, faith, and fear. This is not the story of kings and queens you read in school. This is the interior history, the silent rise, the hidden pain, and the unspoken brilliance behind one of the most powerful empires in human history. Greater than you're watching StillRise, where we don't just tell history, we listen to the silence behind it. Subscribe if you believe real power isn't always loud. Now, let's begin where most stories end, in the forgotten corners of time. The roots beneath the crown. To understand the rise of the United Kingdom, we must start not with kings, but with chaos, not with power, but with fragments long before the word Britain held any global weight. The land itself was divided, not politically, but spiritually, culturally, and tribally. It carved symbols into stones and raised silent monuments like Stonehenge, whose purpose still escapes modern logic. The first inhabitants of rhythm, of an early society that respected nature's unseen laws. Thousands of years before the Romans, the land was home to ancient hunter-gatherers. But in their silence, they spoke of order. These early people weren't just surviving, they were observing, courting, and aligning themselves with cosmic cycles. They built with precision we still don't fully understand. They lived in harmony with the land, a unity the empire would later break and never regain. The Celtic heartbeat. By 800 BCE, Celtic tribes had arrived. Warriors, mystics, farmers, and poets. They brought iron tools, oral history, and a decentralized form of social structure, with druids as spiritual leaders. The Celts had no emperor, no palace, and no need for written records. They passed power through words, songs, and ritual. Their greatest strength was their invisibility. They did not centralize, and so could not be easily destroyed, never forgot the names of its enemies. They brought with them stone cities, taxes, roads, and hierarchy. Didn't build colosseums, didn't kneel to Caesars. But that strength would soon become a weakness. Because across the narrow sea, a very different kind of empire had begun to stir. One that documented everything, built roads to conquer. The Romans were coming. Roman invasion, order meets resistance. A woman who had lost her daughters to Roman violence and turned her grief into fury. In 43 AD, the Roman Empire landed in Britain under Emperor Claudius. With legions trained for domination, to the Roman mind, the Celts were wild and disordered. They didn't write laws, trying to divide the civilized from the barbaric, and so they must be tamed. But the land fought back. In the hills of modern-day Wales and Scotland, the Celts refused to surrender their rhythm. Tribes like the Iceni, led by Queen Boudica, burned Roman cities to ash. Boudica became a silent flame of rebellion. Her uprising was crushed, but not forgotten. Roman rule and its quiet cracks. Rome stayed for nearly 400 years. It built walls, like Hadrian's Wall, but the land never fully absorbed Roman control. The people adapted, blending languages, beliefs, and customs, a slow, silent fusion. And eventually, Rome fell. Not in a loud collapse, but in a slow withdrawal. By 410 AD, the Romans had left, and with them, their structure. What remained was not order, but emptiness. And in that silence, new invaders came, hungry to write the next chapter of Britain's fractured soul. The Anglo-Saxons. The echoes of invasion greater than Rome left. Power does not remain empty for long. When empires retreat, ambition rushes in, so the soil of Britain trembled again under new boots. The Anglo-Saxon dawn after the Romans departed. Britain was like a house without a roof, exposed, fragile, and open to the sky, and came the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, seafaring tribes from present-day Germany and Denmark. They didn't come with empires. They came with axes. And slowly, they carved up the land. They didn't ask to rule Britain. They simply became it, pushed the native Britons westward. Into Wales and Cornwall, they renamed rivers, restructured clans. They planted the seeds of the English language, quiet, sturdy, and built to absorb. What emerged was not one kingdom, but many. Northumbria and the North Mercia, in the Midlands Wessex and the South Kent, in the southeast, these weren't united. They warred, they traded, they formed fragile alliances. And in their quiet struggle, a new idea was forming. Not Roman, not Celtic, but Anglo-Saxon. But the peace, such as it was, did not last. Because just as the Anglo-Saxons had once crossed the sea to claim this land, another wave was building, and this one came with fire. The Vikings arrive in the late 8th century. Britain woke to a new sound. But the clash of oars and the thunder of northern drums, not hoofbeats or Latin chants, the Vikings, Norse warriors from Scandinavia, raided monasteries, villages, and towns. To the Anglo-Saxons, they were demons. To the Vikings, this land was ripe with gold, grain, and untold glory. They didn't just raid, they settled. They built homes, married locals, and created their own territory in the east. The Danelaw. Britain was now not just a land of many kings, but of two worlds, Christian Anglo-Saxons and pagan Norsemen. And amid this chaos, a quiet, determined man rose from the ashes, a man who refused to let his people dissolve into fear. Alfred the Great, the silent rebuilder in the Kingdom of Wessex. A king emerged who would change everything, not with glory, but with grit. Alfred the Great. He didn't defeat the Vikings in one battle. He outlasted them, with strategy, alliances, and a vision of unity. He reorganized his army, built a navy. He promoted education, preserved ancient texts, and insisted that English, not Latin, be used in writing history. He was the first to call himself King of the Anglo-Saxons, not of a tribe, but of a people. His dream, united land, not through conquest, but through culture. And though he would not live to see that unity, he laid the foundation. The land was changing again. Struggle continues. Even after Alfred, the struggle wasn't over. Viking raids continued. Kings rose and fell. Power shifted like sand. But a new generation of rulers, Alfred's descendants, pushed forward. Slowly they absorbed the Danelaw. They unified the kingdoms. By the mid-10th century, under King Athelstan, England was finally officially one kingdom. But the peace was brief, because across the sea in Normandy, a new shadow was forming, one that would forever redefine what it meant to be English. And in 1066, that shadow would cross the Channel. The rise of Parliament and the power of law by the early 13th century. The English monarchy had stretched itself too far. Wars, taxes, and unchecked royal authority had bred unrest among barons, landowners, and even the clergy. Then came the year 1215, at the fields of Runnymede. King John was forced to seal a document, the Magna Carta. It wasn't just ink on parchment. It was the birth of constitutional restraint. For the first time in history, a king acknowledged that even he was not above the law. Rights to fair trials, limitations on taxation, protection of property. It was the silent beginning of a political revolution, one that would echo for centuries. Though the Magna Carta was revised, ignored, and even retracted in parts, its core idea never vanished. As centuries passed, Parliament began to grow from a royal advisory council to a legislative force. The House of Lords, made of nobility and clergy, the House of Commons, representing the emerging middle class. Together, they began to shape policy, limit kings, and slowly forge democracy from within a monarchy. During the Tudor era, particularly under Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, England saw both centralization of royal power and the strengthening of institutions beneath it. The Church of England was born. The monarchy became the head of both state and religion. But Parliament, always watching, always recording, began learning how to negotiate power. It was a silent rise, not through revolution, but evolution. One negotiation, one statute, one session at a time. By the 1600s, the question was no longer whether the monarchy would share power, but how much power the people could eventually claim for themselves. The Civil War, the Silent Crown, and the Glorious Shift. The 17th century didn't arrive quietly. As the Tudor era ended, James I of Scotland took the English throne, beginning the Stuart dynasty. He believed in the divine right of kings. Parliament believed in law, rights, and negotiation. The two were bound for collision. Under his son, Charles I, that collision turned into war. A civil war, brother against brother, crown against country. It wasn't just a fight over politics, it was a war for the soul of Britain. In 1649, in a moment that would shake every throne in Europe, Charles I was executed by his own people, the king's head severed, not in anger, but in legal judgment. For a time, the monarchy vanished. England became a commonwealth, led by a stern, silent man, Oliver Cromwell. He ruled not as king, but as Lord Protector, though his grip was no less iron. It was a strange time, a country without a crown, yet not fully free. After Cromwell's death, chaos loomed once again. And so, in 1660, the monarchy was restored, but not as it was. Then, just a few decades later, another King James II would test the boundaries once more. He was Catholic, absolute, unyielding. But this time, there would be no war, no bloodshed. In 1688, Parliament acted with quiet precision. They invited William and Mary from the Netherlands to take the throne under clear conditions. This moment became known as the Glorious Revolution. It was silent, bloodless, but final. The crown would now rule by law, not by birthright alone. And in 1689, the English Bill of Rights was born. Free speech in Parliament, no cruel punishments, regular elections. A monarchy bounded forever. The United Kingdom was becoming something unique, a kingdom led by a crown, but governed by principles. Empire, machines, and shadows, the 18th century arrived with quiet ambition. But beneath the surface, storm was building. Britain had tamed its monarchy. Its parliament now held true power, and with stability came something else. Ambition. Across the seas, ships left British ports bound for lands few had ever seen. The British Empire, once scattered and uncertain, began to solidify. India, the Caribbean, Canada, West Africa. Not through grand declarations, but through slow contracts, trade posts, and silent takeovers. In 1757, a battle in Bengal would set a new course. Not won by kings or knights, but by merchants, the East India Company. Back home, another revolution stirred. It's not of war, but of wheels and steam. The Industrial Revolution began not with fire, but with silence. In the coal mines, in the ticking of spinning frames, in the clanging of looms behind factory walls. The countryside changed. Villages turned into towns. Children became workers, and time became money. London, once a medieval capital, became the heart of a growing machine. It breathed coal, spoke in contracts. It moved with the rhythm of progress. But as Britain rose, others rebelled. In 1776, its American colonies broke away shouting words they had learned from British philosophers. Liberty, rights, representation. Britain listened, not with anger, but with calculation. It lost a colony, but kept the world. By 1800, the Union of Great Britain and Ireland was signed. A new political map, a new crown, a bigger, more unified island. But it was more than just land. It was an idea. That Britain was not just a kingdom, it was an empire in motion. Quiet, relentless, and growing. Smoke, crown, and revolt. The 19th century opened with smoke, coal, steel, industry. London's skyline turned black with progress. The Industrial Revolution was no longer a whisper. It was a roar. In cities like Manchester, Birmingham, and Glasgow, machines replaced men. Work changed from craft to clockwork. Children worked. Mothers coughed. Fathers labored 12-hour days. And still, the empire grew. But behind this empire of gears and coal stood a quiet symbol, the British crown. Queen Victoria had not yet ascended. But the monarchy began its transition from rulers of policy to figures of unity. In 1801, the Union Jack flew over a new entity, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. But even unity could not stop the unrest. The Napoleonic Wars had drained the treasury, yet they gave Britain something priceless: global power. At Waterloo in 1815, British forces, alongside allies, ended Napoleon's dream. And for a moment, Britain stood tallest in the world. But victory brings pressure. Back home, the people were tired. Corn laws, high food prices, brutal working conditions. The poor protested in silence, then with words, then with blood. In 1819, the Peterloo Massacre. Citizens gathered peacefully, soldiers charged, dozens killed. It was a warning that the crown and parliament were drifting away from the people. In the shadows, a new class was rising, the middle class. Merchants, bankers, clerks, writers. They wanted more than just wages. They wanted voice. So Parliament passed reforms, slowly, reluctantly. But the people kept demanding. Railways spread like veins across the country. Letters traveled faster. News flowed. The island began to feel smaller. And just as the century approached its midpoint, a young queen would take the throne. Her name was Victoria. And her silence would define an entire era. The Victorian Veil. She was just 18 when she ascended the throne. Yet Queen Victoria would become the longest-reigning monarch in British history for over 60 years. This was the Victorian era, an age of quiet strength, royal restraint, and the illusion of stability. The United Kingdom was now an empire, spanning a quarter of the globe, from the sunlit coasts of Australia to the crowded ports of India, to the snow-covered fields of Canada. But at home beneath the polished silverware and royal portraits, a different story unfolded. Factories worked round the clock. Children stitched garments in silence. Women protested for suffrage and were silenced. The rich read Dickens by candlelight while the poor lived his novels. Victorian society had layers. Royalty on top, then the lords, then the merchants. And at the bottom, those whose names history rarely remembers. But something was changing. Electricity flickered into homes. Telegraphs clicked across the Atlantic. Steamships and railways tied the world tighter. Science challenged faith. Darwin's theory shook the church. People whispered. Was man just an animal? Still, the Queen said nothing. She became a symbol. Not of command, but of continuity. Prince Albert, her husband, was her only true companion. When he died in 1861, Victoria wore black for the rest of her life. And Britain, too, entered a darker mood. In Ireland, famine had scarred generations. In India, the 1857 revolt had been crushed, but left wounds no crown could cover. The British Empire ruled more than 400 million people. But how many were truly free? By 1900, Britain was at its imperial peak. But cracks had begun to show. Under the surface, the Victorian veil was wearing thin. And a new century approached with new voices, new wars, and new questions. Cracks in the crown, the sun still rose over the empire, but in the shadows something was shifting. The year was 1901. Queen Victoria, the figurehead of an age, was gone. The world she ruled began to disappear with her. The new century arrived not with celebration but with uncertainty. King Edward VII took the throne, but the crown felt heavier now. The empire was vast, but its soul was tired. The people whispered. Were they still building something great? Or merely guarding ruins? Then came 1914, a single gunshot in Sarajevo, and the world spiraled into chaos. World War I swallowed Britain whole. Over 6 million British men were mobilized. Almost 1 million never returned. The trenches of France were not royal. There was no glory, only mud and silence. At home, the empire cracked. Women took the jobs of men. They drove trams, built weapons, delivered mail, and when the war ended, they didn't want to go back. The suffragette movement roared. Votes for women, no longer a dream, but the empire had changed. In Ireland, rebellion brewed. The Easter Rising of 1916, the Irish War of Independence. By 1922, Ireland was split, a wound that still bleeds. The colonies too stirred. In India, a man named Gandhi began walking, quietly, peacefully, but shaking the empire to its roots. Meanwhile, the world's economy collapsed. The Great Depression reached Britain's shores. Factories closed, families starved, and the working class began to ask, what has the empire given us? By 1936, another monarch fell. Edward VIII abdicated the throne not for politics, but for love. shocked the nation. But beneath it, it revealed a deeper truth. The crown was no longer untouchable. A quiet erosion had begun, not by bullets, not by war, but by the invisible pull of time. The United Kingdom entered the Second World War in 1939, still powerful but no longer unbreakable. The age of absolute empire was ending. And something else was rising, not in palaces or parliaments, but in the hearts of ordinary people. The war that changed everything. This country is at war with Germany. It was September 1939. Britain was tired, but it stood once more. London braced itself. And then the sky fell. The Blitz. Night after night, bombs rained. Children hid in underground stations. Families buried memories beneath rubble. But something strange happened. The people didn't break. They stood in line. Danced after raids. They were battered but not defeated. Winston Churchill, a man many once doubted, spoke fire into their hearts. "We shall fight on the beaches. We shall never surrender." These words weren't just speeches. They became the nation's spine. But war isn't won by words alone. Dunkirk, a miracle in retreat. Thousands rescued, not by soldiers, but fishermen, teachers, grocers. The Battle of Britain, fought in the skies. Teenage pilots and Spitfires held back the storm. They were boys, but they held the line. And then in 1945, silence again, victory, but at a cost. Nearly 500,000 Britons dead, cities ruined, economy shattered. The empire had won the war but lost something deeper, its invincibility. India would soon be gone. Africa would follow. At home, something extraordinary happened. In 1945, the people voted not for the war hero, but for change. Winston Churchill was removed, and in his place, Clement Attlee, a quiet man. But what he built changed Britain forever. The National Health Service, free education, public housing. For the first time, the empire looked inward, toward its own people. It was no longer just about colonies and crowns. It was about care. From the ashes of war rose something rare, a nation rebuilding itself. Not for glory, but for dignity. So, by the early 1950s, the United Kingdom stood at a new doorstep. Smaller, weaker, but somehow more human. Losing the world to find itself. In 1952, the crown passed to a young woman, Elizabeth, only 25 years old. But the empire she inherited was already disappearing. The sun had not yet set on the British Empire, but it was getting dim. In India, the jewel was already gone. Now Africa followed. One by one, Ghana, Kenya, Nigeria, Uganda, they slipped through royal fingers. But this wasn't collapse. It was something stranger. The British didn't fight to keep them not like before, because the people back home were too tired, too burdened, too changed. In 1956, the world reminded Britain of its new place. The Suez Crisis. Egypt reclaimed its canal. Britain, France, and Israel invaded, but then America said no. And for the first time in modern memory, Britain backed down. It was a humiliation. It's not of armies, but of identity. The world no longer needed Britain to lead. At home, things felt oddly stable. The post-war welfare state expanded. Children got free milk. Hospitals got funding. People called it the Golden Age. But beneath the calm, cracks were forming. The 1960s came. The Beatles played. London danced. The world called it the swinging 60s. But it wasn't just music. It was revolution. Old class barriers loosened. Women found louder voices. Immigrants from the Caribbean, South Asia, and Africa arrived invited to rebuild the empire that had left them. And yet they were not always welcomed. Race riots, signs that read "No blacks, no dogs, no Irish." Britain was changing, but not fast enough. In Northern Ireland, a storm was brewing. Civil rights, suppression, explosions. By the late 1960s, the troubles had begun. Catholics and Protestants, British troops on Irish streets, a conflict with no simple side, would haunt the nation for decades. By the 1970s, the economy began to bleed. Strikes, power cuts, garbage piled in the streets. The country that once ruled the waves couldn't even keep its lights on. In 1979, the people chose a different voice. Margaret Thatcher, the first woman prime minister. But her rise didn't feel gentle. She came not to preserve, but to break. Britain, by the end of the 70s, had lost much: its empire, its global dominance, its certainty. But something deeper had been found. A democracy learning how to survive its own myths, kingdom slowly becoming a country. Crowned in a fading world, Elizabeth was young, graceful, and calm under pressure. But the burden she carried was older than any crown. She wasn't just the Queen of England, she was queen of what remained of an empire that once ruled a quarter of the world. One by one, nations broke away, not in war, but in quiet signatures, in closed-door meetings, in late-night telegrams. Ghana, Kenya, Nigeria, Jamaica, Trinidad. Flags came down. New ones were raised. The British Empire was not falling in fire, it was dissolving. In silence, but Elizabeth didn't resist it. She accepted the change, she adapted to it. She became not an empress, but a symbol of dignity, of continuity, stillness in a spinning world. Meanwhile, Britain itself was changing. Gone were the factories of empire. Gone was the global power. In its place, a welfare state. Free healthcare, education, housing. The empire was shrinking. The nation was trying to rebuild something different, something fairer. Storms behind palace walls, the monarchy had weathered wars, an empire collapsing, and a new world rising. But what came next wasn't from outside, it was from within. In the 1980s, a new figure entered the frame. Diana, young, shy, different, she married Prince Charles in a ceremony watched by 750 million people. To the world, it looked like a fairy tale. But behind palace walls, it was anything but. Diana became a global icon, not because she followed royal rules, but because she quietly broke them. She held the hands of AIDS patients. She walked through landmine fields. She spoke about pain, anxiety, depression, things the monarchy never touched. The world loved her. The palace didn't know what to do with her. And then came the crash. 1997. Diana dies. A car accident in Paris, the world cried. But the palace said nothing. For days, the silence was deafening. For the first time in centuries, the British people looked at the monarchy and asked, "Do we still need this?" Queen Elizabeth responded. Late but clear, she stepped outside the gates. She bowed to Diana's coffin. In that moment, the crown bent. Not to politics, not to war, but to the people it survived. Barely. The crown, after Diana's death, the monarchy stood at a crossroads. For the first time in centuries, the British royal family wasn't just dealing with public sorrow, they were dealing with public doubt. And yet, they endured. The Queen adapted. Quietly, she began speaking more openly, smiling more in public, meeting people, not just officials. Not because she changed who she was, but because the world had changed around her. She didn't chase popularity. She preserved dignity. In the decades that followed, Britain itself was evolving. The empire was long gone. But so was the old Britain. New faces, new voices. A multicultural society with roots in Asia, Africa, the Caribbean, and beyond. In 2005, Charles married Camilla. The public was uncertain, but the Queen gave her blessing. The monarchy was shifting slowly but visibly. And then came a new generation. William and Harry, raised in a different world. Educated with empathy, speaking about mental health, the environment, and war trauma. For a brief moment, it looked like the crown might finally feel modern. But once again, history repeated itself. Harry and Meghan, another love story, another storm. Accusations, interviews, tabloids, divides. And once again, the monarchy stood silent until silence wasn't enough. In 2022, Elizabeth died. 70 years as queen, the longest reigning monarch in British history. And now the crown rests on Charles's head. But the world it now represents isn't an empire. It's an island quietly navigating identity, unity, and relevance in the 21st century. Nation searching for itself when the Queen died in 2022. It wasn't just the end of a reign. It was the quiet end of an age where duty was silent and power was ceremonial. The empire was already gone. But something deeper disappeared with her. A certain idea of Britain. The country was changing. Not just its economy or its flag, but its soul. After centuries of ruling the world, Britain found itself small, anxious, and unsure. The days of Churchill, colonies, and empire felt like they belonged to a different planet. And yet, they echoed. In conversations, in newspapers, in politics. Then came Brexit, 2016. A quiet referendum with loud consequences. Leave or remain. Not just in the EU, but in history. Many voted for sovereignty, control, pride, others for openness, trade, unity. But underneath it all was a question Britain couldn't answer. Who are we now when we're no longer rulers? Scotland wanted out. Northern Ireland looked toward Dublin. Wales questioned its role. London felt like a different country, young and old, divided, cities and villages. Strangers. It wasn't a war, but it was a fracture, a quiet unraveling. Politics became theater. Prime ministers came and went like chapters. David Cameron, Theresa May, Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, Rishi Sunak. All promising clarity but leaving only complexity. And yet Britain endured. Not through power, but through something older than government, greater than ritual, resilience and remembering. Pubs, poetry, gardens and sarcasm, rain and resolve. It is no longer an empire, but it is still a people, bound not by conquest, but by stories. From Shakespeare to Stormzy, from Dover's cliffs to Grenfell Tower, Britain became what it always quietly feared: ordinary, but free. The island that refused to surrender. A quiet ending in the end. It wasn't war, it wasn't revolution, it wasn't rebellion or collapse that brought the empire down. It was silence, time, and the gentle erosion of belief. The United Kingdom, once the most powerful force on earth, did not fall. It simply became something else. From the days of the Celtic tribes, to the Roman roads that still run under British cities, to Viking longships and Saxon kings, to the Black Death and the Red Rose, to the fire that consumed London and the machines that built an empire, every chapter whispered something. Country built on contradiction, order and rebellion, tradition and transformation. A monarchy that still breathes, and a parliament that still argues. The 20th century tested it. The 21st confused it. But it didn't break. When Brexit divided homes, when the Queen passed in silence, when Scotland whispered independence and Northern Ireland wrestled with its ghost still, the Union held. Not because it was unbreakable, but because people still believed in the idea, even if they no longer understood it fully. The empire is gone. The colonies have their flags. The Navy sails fewer seas, but London still stands. Big Ben still chimes. The silence remains, heavy, wise, enduring. Because Britain was never just an empire. It was a mirror for the world, for power, for the cost of ambition, and most of all, for how history doesn't end with war, but with forgetting. Softly, quietly, and yet something remains. A rhythm, a habit of resilience, a strange peace with contradiction. Britain endures, not by force, but by adaptation, by survival through silence. No grand finale, no last stand. It's just fog, cobblestone, a stubborn crown, and a people still walking forward, still arguing, still remembering, still here. History doesn't end with battles won or borders drawn, ends in silence. In the spaces between memory and myth, between what was and what we choose to remember, this was not just the story of kings and queens, not just the story of war or empire, but of endurance, adaptation, change that came quietly. A reminder that some nations rise not with noise but with discipline, dignity, and sometimes with nothing but time. If this story moved something within you, if the silence spoke louder than the facts, subscribe to StillRise. Because here, we don't just tell history, we listen to it. Slowly, calmly, silently,